When you think of wrestlers who have had an evergreen career, you often think about people like The Undertaker or Chris Jericho, performers who have been able to stay on top for decades due to their consistent ability to adapt and change. One name you don't often hear in along with these, however, is MVP, and what a shame that is, because this is a spot he most certainly deserves. Yes, since the mid-2000s, Montel Vontavious Porter has managed to remain a star all across the world, with this being even more impressive when you consider the fact that now, in the twilight of his run, he's arguably more relevant than ever before. But how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Ballin, the MVP story. Alvin Antonio Burke was born in Miami, Florida on October 28, 1973, and it was there that, despite his father being a police officer, he would find himself getting involved in an early life of crime. In fact, when he was still just 12 years old, Alvin would join a street gang, with the criminal activities they would commit at this time eventually being what saw him get locked up in a juvenile detention facility during his teenage years, and then later spent 9.5 years inside of a prison on armed robbery and kidnapping charges. It would, however, be while in prison that the youngster began to turn his life around, with him there converting to Islam and changing his name to Hassan Hameen Assad, committing himself to a new life from that point under the tutelage of his new community. And that was how, after being released, Hassan would begin the process of rebuilding, something that was made easier by the fact that, while still in prison, he had become friendly with a corrections officer who also moonlighted as an independent wrestler, with this connection eventually being enough to get him an in with Norman Smiley and Soulman Alex G, both of whom would begin training him in the ways of the ring in 2002. Of course, training in combat sports was nothing new to Hassan though, as by then, he was already adept in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, with him taking the skills he'd learned there and adapting them into his early wrestling style, a style which he would begin to show the world later that year when he began hitting the ring on the local indie circuit, using the name of Antonio Banks as he wrestled for the likes of Full Impact Pro and Future of Wrestling. And quickly making a name for himself, he would soon graduate to bigger promotions, such as Ring of Honor and TNA, the latter of which he would sporadically make appearances for throughout 2003 and 2004. That said, it wasn't until 2005 that the rookie would get his first big break though, as it was then that he would be signed up to a developmental contract with WWE, with him from there being sent down to Deep South Wrestling, where he would create a new character known as Montel Vontavious Porter, an arrogant, self-obsessed athlete who demanded to be seen at all costs. And liking what they were seeing with this gimmick, WWE bosses would call him up to the main roster on the August 4th, 2006 episode of SmackDown, with him initially being described as the hottest free agent in the industry, one whose services had been sought out by both brands and who was currently negotiating with the, at the time, SmackDown general manager Teddy Long over a lucrative contract to make him a Blue brand exclusive. And of course, MVP would continually amp up the heel antics throughout these proceedings too, often stopping conversations midway through so as to admire his jewelry or take calls on his mobile phone. And this was something that always managed to draw huge heat from fans in attendance, with this only making them want to see the cocky villain get beat up that much more come the time of his official signing with SmackDown on September 26th of that year. But as it turned out, they would have to wait a little bit longer for this comeuppance, because during his early matches on the Red brand, MVP would handpick a number of jobber opponents to beat up handily, this only stoking the fires of hatred against him all the more until finally, Kane, who'd had enough of his antics by then, answered an open challenge the rookie put out and set about introducing him to WWE his way. And this would lead to a feud between the two men over the next couple of months then, as the heel narrowly eked out a number of victories over the Big Red Machine, establishing himself as a player in the process. By the time the program was over though, he would be on the losing end, as at December 17th's Armageddon pay-per-view, he would make the mistake of taking on Kane in an Inferno match, with him ultimately getting set on fire here and kayfabe suffering first-degree burns as a result, this being enough to put him out of action for a while as he retreated to lick his wounds. When he did return after that, he'd wisely decided that he didn't want any more of the Big Red Machine, and so instead segued into a feud with Chris Benoit, with this one centering on the Florida boy's desire to take the Crippler's United States title away from him. And as it turned out, he would do just this, as after losing at both WrestleMania 23 and the subsequent month's Backlash pay-per-view, Montel would finally get the better of his opponent during a 2 out of 3 falls match at May 20th, 2007's Judgment Day, pinning the Canadian that night in 2 straight falls to become a champion for the first time on the main roster. After that, he would prove this victory was no fluke, as he had excellent title defenses against the likes of Ric Flair and Matt Hardy in the weeks and months that followed, the latter of which would also see him get to flex his sports entertainment skills, as during the build-up, the champion would get to have a series of in-ring skits with version 1. Skits that saw him take part in things like arm wrestling matches and even a boxing match at one point, with this boxing match eventually seeing MVP taking a knockout punch from former undisputed heavyweight boxing champion Evander Holyfield. And as if that wasn't enough, the two would also get involved in WWE's favorite storyline too, when the heated rivals were forced to coexist in tag team competition after Teddy Long had put them in a tag team title match together against the, at the time, champions Deuce and Domino. Of course, this was a match they would ultimately win, and so, from there, they would have to defend their newly acquired belts, all while arguing over who was the real captain of the team. In the end, though, despite eventually getting on the same page, they would lose those belts, with this enraging Montel so much that he from there lay waste to Hardy, accidentally injuring him in the process, as the feud temporarily got put on hold while the US champ had a series of placeholder matches against the likes of Rey Mysterio and Ric Flair in the meantime. Come WrestleMania 24 on March 30th, 2008, however, version 1 would be ready to return to the ring, something which he did in style, as, during that show's Money in the Bank ladder match, he would run down to the ring to hit MVP with a twist of fate, costing him the win, as he then announced his intentions to take his rival's title away from him. Unable to contain their hatred for each other for much longer then, the match between the two would finally be set for the following month's Backlash, where, after 11.5 minutes, the Miami Boy's reign would come to an end after 343 days, this making him the longest-running United States champion in WWE history at that point. But this was little solace to him in that moment, as, by then, all he wanted was to get his title back as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, though, not only would he not be able to do this, but he wouldn't be able to pick up a win at all for the next 5 months as it happened, because, following his title loss, Montel would go on a huge losing streak, this seeing him kayfabe miss out on both his contractual bonus and his extravagant ring entrance. It wouldn't be until January 16th of 2009, in fact, that he would finally get another win, with this coming at the expense of the Big Show during a last man standing match on that week's episode of SmackDown. And as this win was able to secure Triple H a spot in that year's Royal Rumble match as per a pre-bout stipulation, it would have the knock-on effect of turning MVP babyface for the first time in his career, as he now began lapping up the cheers of audiences, all while going on to defeat Shelton Benjamin on the March 20th episode of the Blue Brand to become US champion for a second time. After this, he would be moved over to Raw during the 2009 draft, taking the US belt there with him as he began establishing himself as one to watch on the Red Brand too. Unfortunately though, during this period, he would lose his hard-won gold to Kofi Kingston, this leaving him to have to fight from the bottom once again, as he, from there, formed a tag team with Mark Henry, with the two at points challenging Chris Jericho and The Big Show for the unified WWE Tag Team titles. But it wasn't just tag competition that Montel was limiting himself to at this point, as he would also return to singles action come the new year too, when he got involved in a feud with The Miz, with this one seeing the duo face off at both the 2010 Royal Rumble and the subsequent month's Elimination Chamber pay-per-views. And following that, the Florida native would be moved back over to SmackDown again, where he would team up with Rey Mysterio to take on CM Punk and Luke Gallows on his first night back, this re-establishing him as a top prospect on the Blue Brand. Sadly though, this would also represent the beginning of the end for his time with WWE, as by this point, after having taken up a mentorship role in the second season of NXT later that summer, Montel would find his on-screen role gradually being reduced, dropping to the point that he'd soon become little more than a utility player, acting as an easily disposable member of that year's SmackDown Survivor Series team, all before getting released from his contract on December 2nd, with his last match in the company at that time being in a losing tag effort with Kaval against Drew McIntyre and Dolph Ziggler. And the reasons for this release appear to have been that the WWE at the time felt like his character had run its course and that they had nothing left for him creatively. Of course, this was something that Montel obviously disagreed with, and so from there, he would set about proving that he still had a lot to offer, not just in the world of wrestling, but in the world of music too as it happened. Yes, that's right, it was in the summer of 2011 that MVP would release his first single, Holla to the World, with this eventually getting some additional exposure through a later iTunes release as well. That said, what most fans will remember him for during this period would be his run with New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he would quickly establish himself as a formidable heel after joining the villainous Kojima-gun. From there, having a series of great tag and singles matches that ultimately saw him enter that year's New Japan Cup, and even at one point, get to tap out the legendary Hiroshi Tanahashi. And as if that wasn't enough, when New Japan held a tournament to crown their inaugural Intercontinental Champion later that year, MVP would run wild through the brackets, picking up pinfall wins over both Kazuchika Okada and Tetsuya Naito en route to beating Toru Yano in the finals to crown himself the first ever holder of that particular belt. Following this, he would routinely defend this belt, all while taking part in both the 2011 and 2012 G1 climaxes, putting out impressive showings each year as his star continued to rise. Come 2013, however, this run in Japan would have come to an end as, now having long since lost his IC title, the Florida native would decide that it was time to go back home, with him reasoning then that he needed to recharge his batteries after having put his body through the ringer working the punishing New Japan style for the last 2 years. That was how, after finishing up his final date with the company at January 4th's Wrestle Kingdom 7, he would return stateside at the end of the month, where he would make his re-debut with Impact Wrestling, initially acting as a storyline investor and authority figure within the company as he set about starting a feud with their president, Dixie Carter. And after his hand-appointed team managed to defeat Dixie's team at that March's Lockdown pay-per-view, Montel would take over storyline control of the company's wrestling operations from there on in, as per a pre-match stipulation, with him now turning heel as he announced his intention to return to the ring and take the TNA World title away from Eric Young. Unfortunately though, before he could do that, he would suffer a torn meniscus, with this putting him out of action for the immediate future and forcing him to remove himself from the upcoming match. And what a pity this turned out to be then, because it's since been suggested that he was actually supposed to win the belt come the end of this program, something which would have represented his first world title win during his career. Nevertheless, even if he was no longer an active title challenger by the time he returned, he would remain an important part of storylines anyway, with him now removing himself from the position of authority figure and instead aligning himself with Bobby Lashley, vowing to help him reach the top as his on-screen manager and occasional tag team partner. Yes, while he was still able to wrestle at this point, MVP had begun the process of taking more of a back seat from the ring, spending less time in matches and more time on the mic so as to help the accumulated wear and tear on his body heal up. That said, he would still hit the squared circle from time to time, even going as far as to make indie dates too, appearing for the likes of Tommy Dreamer's House of Hardcore, and there having notable matches against the likes of Moose, Jack Swagger, and Big Cass. Back in Impact though, he would be kept busy forming a new stable named the Beatdown Clan, basically a prototypical version of WWE's Hurt Business that saw the veteran and Lashley align themselves with Samoa Joe, Low Ki, Kenny King, and Eric Young as they became the scourge of the main event division. And so for a while things were good then. That was until the Almighty decided he'd had enough of his new friends and turned on them, once again echoing what was to come in the future. After that, MVP would return to the ring as he set about getting revenge by challenging his old client for the Impact World title. And though he wouldn't be successful in winning the gold, he and his remaining Beatdown Clan associates would move on to a lengthy feud with the Rising from there, eventually beating them in a 4-on-3 handicap match on the July 1st episode of Impact Wrestling, this forcing the babyface stable to disband as a consequence of the pre-match stipulation. As it happened, however, this would end up being the Florida Boy's last major moment in TNA as, just a couple of weeks later, he would end up leaving the company, with it later coming to light that he'd been involved in contract tampering after he started making dates for Lucha Underground on the side, with him there trying to convince Hernandez to abandon his contract and jump ship to Impact instead. And of course, this would also leave him without a job in Lucha Underground going forward too, so with this in mind, Montel decided to spend some time focusing on other endeavors such as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, with him entering the IBJJF Masters World Championship around this time and going as far as to win a gold medal in the Masters 4 Male Purple Ultra Heavy category. But aside from that, he would also continue to wrestle on the indie circuit, performing for the likes of All Pro Wrestling, Booker T's Reality of Wrestling, and Turkish Power Wrestling at this point, with him even winning world titles in the former two promotions. And as well as this, he would also become a player in Court Bauer's then newly relaunched Major League Wrestling, primarily working as a backstage agent there, but also hitting the ring from time to time as he had memorable matches against the likes of Sami Callihan and current New Japan Strong Openweight champion Filthy Tom Lawler. After that, he would even make a brief return to Ring of Honor, reforming the Beatdown Clan there with Kenny King, as the two made a brief foray into the company's tag team division. But while he would not win gold in ROH at this time, something better would be just around the corner, because on January 26, 2020, MVP would appear as a surprise entrant in that year's Royal Rumble match, coming out in Black Panther-inspired ring gear as he, from there, set his sights straight on the biggest dog in the yard, Brock Lesnar. And while he would not be able to overcome the Beast on this night, his performance would impress Vince McMahon so much that he would from there invite him back as a backstage producer and on-screen performer, with Montel now being given a new talk show segment named the VIP Lounge, during which he would interview various members of the roster. And it was on this talk show that he would even turn heel once more after having attacked fan favorite Drew McIntyre following his big Royal Rumble win. Following this, the former United States champion realigned himself with Bobby Lashley as, now acting as his manager once more, he helped to guide the Almighty into a feud with the, by then, WWE champion McIntyre. And while Lashley wouldn't win the title quite yet during these initial matches, his manager and confidant would be able to soften the blow by adding a new member to their stable in the form of Shelton Benjamin in the weeks that followed. Not long after this, and the unit would finally be complete when Cedric Alexander also signed up, this formally uniting the Hurt Business, arguably the best thing about Raw during 2020, as, acting as a collective of sharply dressed, ass-kicking tough guys, the stable were able to strike fear in the heart of every babyface on the Red Brand's roster over the next few months, using their combined might to take down opponents such as Apollo Crews, who MVP had found himself getting into a heated feud with around this time over the US strap. In fact, it was during this feud that, after Crews had not been able to appear for a scheduled match at July 19th's The Horror Show at Extreme Rules, the former US champ would take it upon himself to crown himself the current one once more, this starting an unofficial third reign for him. And even if his opponent would end up beating him after this to formally take his gold back, the Hurt Business as a unit would only continue to go from strength to strength in the following weeks as, before long, Lashley himself would have become the United States champion. All while elsewhere, Benjamin and Alexander were winning the Raw Tag Team titles too. And as if all that wasn't enough, on the March 1st, 2021 episode of Raw, MVP would be present to help the Almighty topple The Miz and become the WWE Champion for the first time, this fully solidifying the Florida Boy as the top manager on the brand at the time. Sadly though, as with all good things, the Hurt Business would come to an end soon after this, as, deciding that the act had run its course, Vince McMahon would choose to have Lashley and MVP lay waste to Benjamin and Alexander not long after this, formally severing the ties between the four men. Of course, this decision was met with much pushback by not only fans, but the members of the stable themselves too, each one of whom had allegedly lobbied to keep things going backstage as they felt there was still a lot more juice to squeeze from the group. And while history may be proving them right in this belief, for the time being at least, the Hurt Business would be finished, as Montel continued to manage the Almighty as a solo act from there on in, helping him to keep the WWE title around his waist going into WrestleMania 37 and beyond. In fact, it wouldn't be until the autumn of 2021 that a new challenger, in the form of Big E, would be able to come along and take the title back for the side of the good guys. Of course, by then though, MVP had done such a good job of helping to establish Lashley as a credible threat, his main event position was secured regardless. And since this, seeming to have realized the error of their ways, WWE have even teased reuniting the Hurt Business, with them coming together once more to fend off the New Day on the September 27th episode of Raw. Where things go from there is anyone's guess, but one thing's for sure, given the career he's had up to this point, MVP is a shoo-in for a Hall of Fame induction once he retires, as he's long since proven by now that, whether it's in the ring, on the mic, or in a backstage role, he really is a talent that can't be ignored and will always remain the most valuable player of any team he's on. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.